empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash in water. If you have one to the extreme, you will be very unscientific. If you have another to the extreme, you become all of a sudden a mechanical man, no longer a human being. So it is a successful combination of both.
Hey, what's up guys? Nick the Informative Fisherman here, and welcome to How to Fish for Fall Bass. I'm going to try to cover the delta, the lakes, just a variety out there, and I'm going to give you a vague outlook of the lures that I like to use, the rods I like to use, my line choice, and how I go about picking these fish apart. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to break down is, what is all this talk about the fall transition? We're transitioning to fall. The fall transition, a lot of people get this confused. A lot of people think, well, this is when the fish start to follow the bait fish into the back of the creeks. And yeah, that's kind of what it is, but what the fall transition really means is the fall turnover. That's when the warmer water from the summer stays on top and you get water stratification. You get different layers of water. And then you have a consistent cold pattern which now chills that top water layer, and it rotates because it becomes colder than that mid-depth, so the water rotates. That's the fall turnover. But what I want you to focus on is not so much that. That does get those bait fish riled up and everything and want to go eat, and it does mix up a lot of food in the water and gets them going. But what I want you to focus on is in bass fishing, when we're fishing for fall fish, what's going to happen is those bass do start following those fish to the mouths of creeks in early fall, progressively get into the middle, towards the later fall they start coming back out. The reason why this is happening is because the majority of forage in our lakes and our river systems is shad. If there's not shad in there, I'm going to explain another pattern to you a little later on, but primarily we're going to cover following shad. Now, when we're following shad, we're going to use a lot of shad imitating baits, like little spoons, shallow running crankbaits, spinner baits, always a very popular choice. Your buzz baits, when they're busting the shad on top of the surface, are killer. When the shad are not being busted out of the surface, your jerk baits are a phenomenal choice. So I'm going to cover all these baits with you a little later here, but what I want to focus on is the shad. Like I said, what happens in early fall, I'm talking lower 60s, around 63 to 61 degrees. What happens at that point, the shads start to migrate to where the little tributary arms and the mouth of these creeks, you're going to start finding the shad on flats around those, on points around those, little sheltered areas where they're going to start progressively moving back. This is early fall. In a lot of places, you're looking at late September, October, depending on where you live, it's going to vary, but know that lower 60-degree water, that's going to be your early fall, and we're going to start targeting the points around that time. And when I say the points, I mean those river entries, those tributary arms. What's going to happen when the water's still warmer, the bass are going to be actively feeding and actively chasing. So a lot of the time you might see bass busting those bait fish on the surface. That's going to be a good time to throw a surface bait. Your spooks are very popular. Your super spooks, the walk the dog style baits. I'm going to throw that on a big rod with probably braid if I'm out in the delta. If I'm on a lake, I'm going to be throwing it on monofilament because it floats. Fluorocarbon would make this bait work wrong. I'll probably break down a video later on about how to walk the dog, but if you don't know how to do that, that's a good technique to learn, and check that out. Another good bait would be like your poppers right here. This is a little popper. These are great, phenomenal baits. You can throw it right out there where they're working the bait fish. Boom, boom, chug it, slap your rod tip down, chug it, and let it hang right there and give the bass the opportunity to smash that. I'm throwing everything in a lot of chrome and white finishes to imitate those shad around that time. In the early fall, what's going to happen is during the sun, you're going to have phytoplankton up near the surface. And what phytoplankton is that algae form that those threadfin shad and other forms of shad feed on. So what happens when the sun's out, that phytoplankton is going to be up near the surface. When you have overcast days, You know, if sporadic clouds, you might have them up near real tight to the surface still busting, but on those overcast days, a lot of the time the phytoplankton is going to suspend. When it starts suspending at that time, that's where these little spoons, shallow running crankbaits, jerkbaits come into play. The most popular bait probably of all time for hard baits is your rattle traps. And these are a lipless crankbait. That's all that means. And the reason for this is you can fluctuate your depth depending on your rod position, how fast you retrieve the bait to cover a lot of water columns. This is a phenomenal bait for catching bass in the fall. You will never see me go around fall bass fishing without a lipless crankbait on board. They're incredible. Now, a lot of the time when they're keying in on those shad, those bigger female bass are hanging around too. The bigger bass only wants to exert a lot of energy for a large meal. This is when I'm going to start throwing swim baits. If I'm out and around shad a lot of time, what happens is when they're keying in on those fish, you have other fish in there too. A lot of the time in your lakes, you're going to have trout eating those shad too. And those bigger bass are going to want to move in while those have their guard down and commit to a trout. This is why I use these big P-line kicker minnows right here. These are a phenomenal swim bait for getting big strikes in the early fall, mid-fall, and even late fall, and I'll break that down. If you're fishing around a lot of grass, the swim jig, the jig with the pointed nose, is fantastic. And all I did was take a fluke, cut the tail off, and use that as my trailer to match the profile of the shad. If I'm fishing around 3-inch shad, hey, I got it covered right there. If I'm fishing around 4, I'll cut the fluke back a little higher up and create that match right there to match the hatch, which is always crucial when you're fall fishing around those shad. You really want to match it. That's why a lot of these things imitate a shad. So now, what I want to take you through is we're into that early fall. It's in the low 60s. They're all out and around there. And I said if they're busting them up on the surface, you want to throw those top water baits. You want to suspend. A lot of the time, you'll get one of those storms that'll come through right then, and it'll shut the bite down. And what happens, a lot of people will start flipping and pitching around these times throughout the summer when the bite gets shut down. But what happens is these fish are still accustomed and keying in on shad. So a lot of the time you have to get them to react, and you have to get down there in that grass. You can either use the rattle trap to get down there if they're suspended in the grass or stuck down there real tight to cover and get this right in their face. But more or less, that's when a swim jig is going to become very effective. You can get it down there in the grass, it's got a weed guard on it, and you can get it right in their face to react. A little trick I like to do is I start drop shotting flukes. They're keying in on shad. If you get it in on their nose, they're going to react. What I'll do is I'll take a pair of scissors and I'll cut off that little arch in there, and I'll take the tail and I'll split it down the middle a little bit more, and when I stick that mosquito hook through his nose and that falls right in front of that bass's face, they're gonna react to it at that time. So if those conditions happen and you're fishing a tournament and it's rough out there and the bite's shut down and they're not hitting any of your hard baits, those are crucial to go to. Your fluke is fantastic, your swim jig is fantastic, and your rattle trap's fantastic. Another thing, if they're not down there in the grass, and everybody knows, a lot of guys know in the spring, jerk baits are fantastic, and the reason why is the jerk bait's as effective as moving as it is sitting still in the water. This is a suspended jerk bait right here. When the shad are moving towards these creek mouths, we're fishing shallow water. So a suspended jerk bait, if your bass is sitting 3 foot under the water and you jerk it and it stops, it's sitting right here and it's eating them up. He just, bam, has to hit it. I will pause this bait up to 15 seconds after a good twitch. Right next to that isolated cover, I see a tree branch right there. I see some grass around it. Jerk, 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 jerk. I will stop it right there and sit it in front of them to drive them crazy. So those are good baits when you have those tough conditions and they're not hitting any other fast bait for you. So that's your early fall. Now what I want to get into is mid-fall. This is the upper 50s to mid-50s. And the shad at that point are going to be moving their ways halfway up those creek arms, a little further back into those little tributary streams. And what's going to happen back then is as the water cools, your bass are not going to want to exert as much energy. So oftentimes casting 3, 4, 5 times to the exact same target is what you're going to often have to do. You have to trigger them at those times. If they're still working shad over, stick with your baits, keep throwing those baits out there. But what you're going to want to do, a good little pattern, when you're looking at mid-fall, those upper 50s, mid-50s, is start further back in the creek arm and power fish your way out of it. And what I mean by power fish is not spend a lot of time on any one target, but very short amount of time on every target you see. Start further up that creek arm, work back fast, stop and hit every target. And what's going to happen is you're going to intercept those bass that are following those shad back into those creeks. If you start out towards the main mouth and work your way up, that's kind of more early fall. You can do that system, start out towards the mouth of those, work your way back up. That's a good system during the early fall, but when you're looking when the water gets down to that mid 50, virgin on 54, 53, start further back in and work your way back at that point. What that's going to help you do is hone in on the fish a whole lot faster like that. So what I'm going to do when I'm searching for fish, always in the fall, when I'm fishing mid-fall, early fall, or late fall not so much, but early fall and mid-fall, I'm going to fish fast. I'm going to be throwing spinner baits. I'm not going to really be throwing slow baits. I'm going to be throwing rattle traps a lot until I get bit, and then I will slow down and pick that apart. And the reason why I'll slow down and pick it apart at that point, in the fall, shad start to really ball up and the largemouth starts schooling. The bass starts schooling to follow that shad. If I catch one bass there, more than likely there's a whole lot more really close by, if not right there with them. So work through fast until you hit one and then slow down and pick that whole area apart, and you're going to get a heck of a lot more fish.
Okay, so let's cut for a quick commercial break, and when we come back, it'll be back to bassin'. Hey, what's up guys? Nick the Informative Fisherman here, and when it comes to spooling up my reels, I choose nothing less than the best, and that's why I use P-Line each and every time. Are you fishing the best?
P-Line, baby. P-Line.
Did you ever wish for an RC boat when you were a kid? And do you have a passion for fishing? Well, guess what? It's time to do them both at the same time. With RCFishingWorld.com's RC Fishing Pole, it's time to be a kid again. So visit www.rcfishingworld.com today. Ever tried pulling a planer board next to your boat when trolling or fishing from a swift current bank? If not, you're missing out on one of the most phenomenal fish catching machines on the market today. With Yellowbird planer boards pulling your lines perpendicular to your boat, you can't help but catch more fish. Find out more by visiting www.yellowbirdproducts.com. Have you been to rustylures.com? Did you know they offer free shipping on anything over $29.99? And with all the latest and greatest in bass fishing gear, from punching tackle, umbrella rigs, swim baits, and you name it, there's really no reason for you not to be getting the best deal online today. So go to www.rustylures.com. Have you had the chance to fish the baddest hoochie on the market today? That's right, I'm talking about the Shasta Tackle Wiggle Hoochie, one of the most dynamic reaction trout and salmon lures that runs second to no other for pulling and triggering fish into striking. So I guess the real question is, are you catching all the fish you should be catching? Thanks for watching, guys, and remember, without sponsor support, this show wouldn't be made possible.
Okay, so now we've reached late fall. This is water temperature in the low 50s. I'm talking, 51, 52, even in the upper 40s, depending on where you live. What's going to happen is the bass are going to start becoming extremely affected by this cold water. The shad are going to start moving back out from the creeks, back out towards the main lake. Through that mid-fall, a lot of them are going to transition up there, eat that plankton, come back out. So when you're looking at lower 50s, upper 40s, those shad are going to be back out towards the mouths of those creeks by the main lake. What's going to happen at this time is the majority of your bass have fed. You're going to have fewer strikes. You're not going to be getting as many. It's becoming that winter time. The bass are going to get sluggish. What's going to happen is they're not going to be up there in that shallow water at that point. As they follow the shad back out, they're going to start looking for creek edges, drop-offs, right out towards the mouths of those tributary arms. You'll find points. Points at that time are going to be much more effective. Sheer ledges are going to be effective. What you want to do is you can start using a little bit deeper diving crankbait than this and get down there and hit along those edges. And you still want to use shad patterns, considering that's what's in their mind. That's what they've been focused on all fall. So by getting down there, your crankbait's going to force them to react to it. Even if they slap at it, you got treble hooks on there. You want to use a crankbait rod, a limber rod, something like a medium action rod. This is a lot of the time I'll use FluoroClear line by P-Line right here. And this is one of my new favorite lines for crankbaiting and jerkbaiting. It's a copolymer. It's a mixture of fluorocarbon and monofilament lines. The advantage to this line is it still has a good amount of stretch, just like mono. So if I'm using a treble hook, I'm not going to rip the hooks free. And another thing is it's part fluorocarbon, so it's going to sink to where I'll still be able to detect that strike right off the bat. If I'm running in, I'm hitting the bottom, I'll still be able to detect that. So it gives me the best of both worlds, so to speak. So now we're in that late fall. They're out there, they're sitting on the bottom. A lot of the time, they're not going to want to chase a shad at that point. So this is where a lot of guys will switch over to a crawdad pattern in the late fall. You'll see half the guys throwing shad patterns, still trying to figure it out. Other guys will start throwing football jigs at this point. Crawdad imitating football jigs. I'll show you what that looks like in a second here. But what's going to happen, and the reason for this, is they're sitting on the bottom. The bass are sitting down there. They're sluggish. They want an easy meal. So something that I will do is I'll throw that kicker minnow again, and I'll use this on a 1/2 ounce kill weight, the EWG kill weight, and that's that bigger hook with that weight down here on the bottom, and I'll Texas rig it. And I'm just going to creep this swim bait right along the bottom to where when they get in there, they know this is their last chance for a big meal, and that's a lot of the time you're going to get those big females to commit right there to a swim bait. A lot of the time they'll do it in the winter too because they know it's a big meal and they know they're going to receive a high reward for that. A lot of protein, a lot of calcium, whatever they need to maintain throughout the winter. They want a big, simple meal. So late fall, start focusing on those bigger baits, slower baits, baits that are going to be associated to the bottom. Fish that mid-depth, fish that mid-water column. But, you know, when the water gets down there, they're not going to be on the surface anymore. They might be suspended halfway down, so jerk baits are going to work good. Rattle trap, you can control your depth and try to get down there. But I'm going to start focusing on jigs. I'll still swim a shad imitating bait down there along with a crawdad presentation that I'll drag on the bottom. I'll throw swim baits, and I will also oftentimes drop shot a fluke. So let's say you were out there a week ahead of time and the water temperatures only fluctuated a few degrees. Now what happens if you're fishing a cove and you're fishing a lot of timber and you don't see too much grass, you don't see too much vegetation around, a lot of the time the fish are still going to be in those areas. But if you have a lot of plant life around, what happens when your water reaches that mid-50s, they start breaking down, they start decomposing, the decomposition. What happens when plants start to do this, they start to consume oxygen. Shad are highly affected by this process. If there's less oxygen in the water, the shad know immediately and they will back out. So what's going to happen if you get to that spot and you know you were hitting them when the water was in that mid to upper 50s and you got there immediately after, you need to move out away from that target. Those shad are going to pull out away from that. They will be affected by that faster than you will think. They'll pull out real fast. Another little tip that I'm going to offer you is instead of always focusing on the creek arms like a lot of advanced bass anglers do, and I find myself doing that and ignoring the obvious, a lot of the time marinas serve the exact same purpose for these shad. I see guys all the time. I will launch, coming out of the boat launch, literally I'm 50 foot off the ramp, guys just hopped in my boat, we're going out and I see balls of shad and my whole entire plan is now thrown out the window. You know, my plan was to run up into this river arm, find the shad up there and fish for them. Well, what happens is a lot of guys ignore what's right there in the marina. We have sheltered water, we have shallow water, we have vegetation, we have plankton blooms back there. Phytoplankton, it gets good sun, the water's calm, so we have a lot of growth back there. Everything's there for the shad. And those bass are not going to say, well, it's a marina, let's not go there. They're there for the food. So a lot of the time fishing marinas is like a real small river. Right to the mouth of a marina to the back of the marina. A lot of the time you can find killer fish right there. I do it all the time, trust me on this. You know, and work it the exact same way. From early fall, start right in the very front of the marina. From late fall, start in the back of the marina and work your way in and work your way out according to those times. What's going to happen more often than not is guys are going to leave those fish alone. You don't have to make a long run. Your fishing time's increased. If you're fishing a tournament and it's legal for you to fish in that marina, another thing that is absolutely crucial when you're marina fishing, patterns with inside a pattern inside a pattern. And what I mean by this, let's say you were fishing along and you were working boat docks and you were working the slips and you know you were catching the majority of your fish on the slips. Now what happens when they're inside the marinas, they will be so keyed in to a pattern, and I'm telling you, a lot of fish will do this, that realistically, they'll be perpendicular to a boat, or they'll run right on the head of a boat or the tail end of a boat. And realistically, if you're focused that much to where you make a cast and you hit one on the tail end of a boat, right out there in 12 feet of water, and you see that, I have been there on days to where I will move in from that boat and I will not get bit. And I will waste a bunch of time. I'll go to the next boat, and guess what? My pattern, within my pattern, was the tail end of that boat, 11 foot of water. Or say that's exactly what I hit it on the first one. I'll catch another one right there, and then I'll move my way back in, and I'll fish these other docks, hoping, instead of realizing that this could be the prime time of the day, this could be the prime feeding time, instead, ignore working the whole slip. Focus on exactly what you did. Look at your graph. Look at the water temperature. Look at the elements outside. Is it still sunny? Is it still overcast? And now power fish. I don't mean fish fast. I mean get to the next spot that matches that spot that you hit it on. Know what you did and duplicate it. Boom, boom, boom. And you will be dead shocked on how many fish and quality fish you will produce following that pattern within the pattern. Now I'm going to go through a quick scenario of my lures, my line, my rods, and why. And I'm going to try to do this fast. Right here I have a P-Line laser minnow. This is 1 ounce. The reason why I'm going to use 1 ounce, it's small. It's got a small profile. It matches a lot of shad. I should get a lot of bites on this. I can bomb this thing. Long range. If I see him busting on shad and I don't want to pull up and spook the school, I can bomb this guy from long range. It's got a treble hook. Needless to say, with the treble hook, you don't get a deep bite on the fish. It's 3 small hooks put together. That means the hook is not penetrating very far. If I were to use braided line and set the hook, I would probably rip the hooks free. I also need a very limber rod, something that's going to keep a lot of stretch in between the fish and I, to where if he swims at me, I can catch up real quick. A lot of guys will say when they're fishing reels with a treble hook, they like slower speeds, so they slow down and not rip the hooks free. That is more or less for crankbait, so you don't work the bait too fast. I like a 7-to-1 speed reel for treble hooks. In that case, if he does swim at me, I don't have to reel extremely fast to catch up. I can keep my load on the fish. The benefit about keeping the load on the fish is if he swims at me and I have slack, the weight of this jig is going to hit and it's going to start working the hooks around, tear a bigger hole. Potential of him throwing the bait is much higher. That's my laser minnow jig right there. My popper, what I'm going to throw is very buoyant line. Fluorocarbon out of the equation. Monofilament or braid are real good choices at this point. The thicker diameter of line you have, the more buoyant it's going to be. The thinner the diameter, the less buoyant it's going to be. So a lot of the time in the lakes, I'm going to use about 12-pound monofilament line on the poppers. In the Delta, I'll use braid a lot of the time strictly because there's a lot of vegetation and I have to work through things or yank it free when it gets hung up. And so in the lakes, 12-pound. In the Delta, if I'm using mono, I'm going to use 15 to 17. If I'm using braid on this, I'm probably going to be throwing 50. The reason why braid for pound test is a much thinner diameter. 50 is right at about 12, 65 is right at around 15, and you do the math from there. For my spooks, this is a lot bigger bait right here, and it's going to work back and forth. It still floats. I do not want to use fluorocarbon. Right here, I'm going to use braid. I'll probably throw a 65-pound braid on this because it's a bigger bait, and I want my line to be buoyant out in front of it. If I'm using mono, I'm going to be using 20-pound tests. I like the CXX right here. This 15-pound CXX right here, the breaking strength is 20-pound. It has a thinner diameter, and this stuff's tough as nails. So that's the P-Line CXX, so try that out for that. For my spinner baits, this is where a lot of people are switching over to fluorocarbon. 100% fluorocarbon for spinner baits, which is great. I think if you're fishing beyond 15, 20 foot deep, use 100% fluorocarbon. If you're fishing shallower than that, start using FluoroClear line, which is that copolymer. It's the mixture between the two. You still have good bite sensitivity, you still have good stretch. The reason why I want a sensitive line that's part fluorocarbon there is I want to make sure I'm ticking obstacles on the bottom. I want to run it into tree stumps. I want to run it into rocks to score a reaction strike. Spinner baits are phenomenal for that. The pound test I'm going to use on average in the fall, I'm going to be using a much lighter spinner bait than this. This is a 3/4 ounce right here. This is a little heavy. I'm going to be getting too deep. Late fall, that might work. But I'm going to be using the quarters and up to a half and nothing heavier, so I know I can stay in that upper water column and stay in their face. So when we're talking about fall fishing here, we're not fishing deep, so I'm not going to use 100% fluorocarbon. I'm going to use a copolymer, or I'm going to use braid. These have two big single hooks. This is a stinger hook right here on the back. You always want to fish a spinnerbait with a stinger hook or a trailer hook, whatever you want to call it. The hooks are deep. I can use a fast action rod. Fast action rod's going to help me target objects a little bit better. A very limber rod, it's really hard to pinpoint that exact object you want to cast to. A fast rod, good amount of backbone. I'm not going to rip hooks free. I'm going to get a good deep bite on the fish. That's what I'm going to use for my spinnerbaits. For my swim baits, I'm using a big single hook. I'm either going to use heavy fluorocarbon line to where I can really feel if they come up and start ticking at the tail, or if I'm real shallow, I'm going to use a copolymer, that FluoroClear once again. With my swim baits, I'm using, on average, the smallest I'm using is a 4/0 hook, and I will use up to 6/0 hook. The P-Line kicker minnows come in a 6-inch, and I will use a 6/0 on the 6-inch and shrink down from there. I like copolymer lines always on my swim baits, or braid. And the reason why is a lot of the time it's a real natural bait. They'll come pick at the tail and you're not going to know if they're really eating it. And a good reminder, when you're hitting a swim bait, wait when that fish takes it, wait for your rod to load up. If you feel your rod getting hit like that, do not set the hook. Wait for your rod to load, then bury into them like that. On my swim baits, a lot of the time I'm going to be using either 50 or 50 on my 4 and 5-inch swim baits. I'll come up to that 65-pound braid on the 6 inches and up. Even if you're going to use a bigger bait than that, the 65-pound braid casts great. It's a good line, and I'm going to use that around a lot of heavy vegetation. If I'm out in a clear body of water, I'm going to use a copolymer. Once again, this is fluorocarbon coated, so it's virtually invisible to where they're not going to see the line, and follow that same principle when you get bit. For your buzzbaits, use a very buoyant line. It's crucial that this buzzbait sits on top of the water and floats at long cast. So I'm going to use a really fast reel once again for these and use a 7-to-1 so I can burn it and keep it up on top. That's crucial for your buzzbaits. I throw nothing less than 17-pound test on buzzbaits. A lot of the time if I'm getting a really long range cast out there, I'm going to use 20, sometimes even 25 or 65-pound braid to 80-pound braid. I won't use 50, the diameter's too thin. The buzzbait will start sinking in the water column and you're defeating the purpose of the buzzbait at that point. Big single hook. You can use a fast action rod or an extra fast action rod to where you can get the hook set on them real fast and hard. Jerk baits. This is where I'm going to go into a lighter line because the jerk bait has a much better action for a thinner diameter. Even in the Delta, I will throw a 15-pound test, FluoroClear once again. The reason for this is I have that good bite sensitivity. It sinks, it's got good stretch. I got tiny treble hooks on there, so I need good stretch. I don't want to rip the hooks free, so I'm going to use that 15-pound test in the Delta. On the lakes, I will drop down to 10-pound test, and if there's a lot of big fish in the lake, I'm going to fish 12-pound test, and I want to throw this on a moderate action rod. Rattle trap, I'm getting it down there in the grass, ripping it free. I'm going to use a 15-pound copolymer line or 100% fluorocarbon if I'm going beyond 15 foot deep. In the Delta, I'm going to be using braid, and I'm going to be using 50-pound braid because I want long range, long cast. We're using treble hooks, so that same purpose is there. You want a moderate action rod. If the hooks get a little bit bigger, if you're using like number 2s with a shorter shank, upgraded bigger bite hooks, you can go with a fast action rod at that point. Just make sure you use a line with a decent amount of stretch in it so you don't waste your time hooking a big one and rip them free. With the jig is a little bit heavier. You're swimming it down there through vegetation. It's got a single hook, fast action rod with a lot of backbone's good. Right here, a lot of the time I like to have a lot of sensitivity because I'm constantly making contact with cover or structure. So I'm going to be using braid at that point, a copolymer line or 100% fluorocarbon. Usually I'm using braid or 100% fluorocarbon on my swim jigs. I have a lot more sensitivity when I'm bumping grass. It's going to be in there in grass, and grass is real light. So I want as most amount of sensitivity as I can possibly get on that bait. That's all my baits. That's the rods I'm using, the actions I'm using, the speeds I'm using. I'm usually using the fastest speed possible. You always got to remind yourself to slow down if you're using a crankbait or something you want to creep along the bottom. Remind yourself. That's something you have to do when fishing. That's the lines I'm using. Go out there, catch some big fall bass. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on my helpline. Write me an email. I will make sure to answer it for you guys. I'm Nick the Informative Fisherman, and that's Fall Bass Fishing with me. Get out there and bust.
It's a bad man's world.